That was the spring that Biddy dropped a ewe lamb. Martha was beside herself with excitement and could hardly wait until Peter got home from school to have him see her. She kept going to the kitchen window, watching to catch a glimpse of Peter coming up from the valley. When she finally saw him, it was getting near dusk. He was never any earlier, but she was impatient for him, and every moment seemed an hour. There was a strong wind, squally, with wet snow. Walking into the face of it, Peter had bent low and looked more like a gnome than a boy as he came up the long hill. He was hurrying, too, for all he looked to his mother as if he were coming so slowly. At lambing time, he could scarcely wait from one day to another to see the new lambs, to see what sheep had twins, to help if any needed special care. He stood in the kitchen shaking off the wet snow, brushing the large, soft flakes from his eyes. "Biddy has her lamb," Martha said. Snow or no snow, Peter opened his eyes wide, not even feeling the flake that fluttered off an eyelash and quickly dissolved in a pool of blue wonder. Is it, he couldn't shape the words, so eager was he. "It is," Martha nodded and smiled, "a ewe lamb." Oh, there was nothing Peter could say. He was so happy. After 3 ram lambs, Biddy had her ewe, one who could grow up beside her and stay in the flock. Andrew came in, shaking the snow off him. He had a lantern in his hand, for night was coming fast on the heels of the snowstorm. By the looks on the 2 faces, he knew what news had been told. A smile brought its light to his, tired as he was from almost 3 days constantly in the barn. "Come and see her, Peter." Peter buttoned his coat and went out to the barn with his father, the light from the lantern moving between them as they walked. In the barn there were other lanterns hanging from beams, and the place was full of soft light and warmth. The only sounds were the crinkle of straw and the tender whickering as ewes talked to their lambs. Benj was busy in a corner and paid no heed to them. Andrew walked easily, but with steps so light they could scarcely be heard or felt. Off against one wall, a little pen had been made. Biddy stood there, placidly chewing some fresh hay. "Come closer, Peter," Andrew said. He lifted the lantern so its light might fall not on Biddy but beside her. There, curled in the yellow straw, was a tiny black lamb. Delight and pride and overwhelming bliss caught the words in Peter's throat. He breathed deep with joy. Then he dropped on his knees in the straw and reached out his fingers to touch the tight curled wool on the head of Biddy's lamb. Biddy looked at him. A rumble of pride moved up her throat and found its way out in a long, low baa. Only one she knew, as she knew Peter, would she let touch so young a lamb. The year had hinges on which it hung, and every hinge had something to do with the sheep. But that was the life on Andrew's farm, and the living for his family, and it was right that the sheep should mark it for them. After the lambing, the next great event was the shearing, and though the days went fast between, there was time for much to happen. With the one, snow was caught in the branches of the trees. With the other, blossoms rode high above the earth. But even better to Peter was the fact that shearing came when school in the valley shut its doors and the children were free to help their parents, some in the fields and houses, some with the flocks and herds. They were all working with the land in one way or another, and every pair of hands was that much more work done. As Andrew's flock grew each year, the work with it increased. The shearer came for 3 days instead of 1, and the barn with its well-swept floor looked as if the snow had drifted into it for the great piles of wool standing there. Peter could work with the men now, and Mary came up from the valley to have an eye to the lambs and give a hand to tying up the bales. She had long since ceased wearing her brown wool dress with the cranberry red buttons, but Peter clung to his coat, short as it was in the sleeves and body and frayed at the edges. When the day got hot, he would take it off and hang it on a peg in the barn. Sometimes he would press a tattered sleeve to his cheek, remembering the days when Biddy was his cosset, and the years between when her coat had kept him warm. Biddy sheared well, not struggling when the men grasped her forelegs and turned her on her back, for she recalled how it had happened other years, and that no one meant her any harm. When the fleece came off, she sprang to her feet and trotted off to find her lamb. The fleece was tossed on to the scale as, being dark, it was weighed and bundled separately. "Less than last year, isn't it?" the shearer commented, as the scales fell short of Biddy's usual mark. "It is," Andrew agreed. "She's beginning to go off." Peter heard them through the bundling he was doing. The cord he was tying slipped in his fingers, and he had to begin the knot all over again. For suddenly he had realized that they were not talking about any sheep in the flock, but about Biddy, his cosset, the flock's leader. Then the fear came on him again, as it had last March, when the black ewe lamb was a few days old, and Andrew and Benj were looking her over. "She's got bone, all right," Benj had said, "and a fleece like her mother's." "She'll be a fine strapping sheep when she gets her growth," Andrew had added, able to resist the winter and drop a good lamb in the spring. "I knew Biddy would have a fine ewe lamb one year. It's well she's got it now, for she's getting on. Another spring or two and her lambs won't be worth culling." Peter had heard them, and everything around him had seemed to stand still. Other sheep got old, lost their usefulness for breeding, and went to market in the autumn. But he had never thought of this happening to Biddy. Somehow he had thought of her going on, year after year. But no, that wasn't the way things happened, no matter how much one wanted them to. All the farm creatures had their span of life and usefulness, and when that time was up, the end was simple, something agreed upon long beforehand. Hearing them speak thus of Biddy had hurt and bewildered Peter, and he had meant to talk to his father about it that evening. But in the meantime he had got over the hurt and reasoned out the bewilderment, so he had said nothing. Now they were at it again, telling each other that Biddy was getting on. "She's just gone 7 years," he put in stoutly. "And she's just in her prime," Andrew answered. Can't she stay there a while?" No one said anything. Peter's question didn't seem to the men to require an answer. Andrew turned toward the next sheep to be sheared. Benj looked out the barn door at the sun. It was at its meridian, and by that Benj knew that they should stop work and turn toward the house for dinner. "High noon," he called out. The shearer laid down his tools, and the sheep was set free. He and Andrew started to the house as Martha opened the door to call them. Benj turned to Peter. "Maybe it would be nice to have the sun stay overhead always. Maybe it would." He wagged his head. "And maybe we wouldn't get anywhere if it did." A smile broke over Peter's face. That would be an odd thing if the sun and he stayed where they both were. He'd never grow up, and evening would never come on. Of course, things were like that. Everything had to go forward, and everyone had to go along too, whether the way could be seen very far ahead and one liked it or not. Now Mary was coming toward him from the orchard, running, her hair lying on the wind and her bare feet swift through the long grass. She was as tall as he was, and she had good sense about the sheep. The lambs turned to her as trustingly as they did to their mothers. Peter had once thought that it was because Mary wore a dress made from spun and woven sheep's wool, and they liked the smell of her. But he saw they did it whatever dress she wore. Mary came flashing through the barn door and stood beside him, panting. Peter pointed to the brown wool, still lying on the scale. "That's a nice fleece Biddy gave this year." "Indeed it is." Dropping on a knee beside it, Mary lost her hand in the thickness of it. "Peter, it's so soft, softer than all the other fleeces." Peter smiled. 2 days ago, I took her down to the brook and washed her all over. I didn't want her wool to be washed again. I want the nice, rich Biddy smell to stay with it after it's made into a coat." "Why, Peter?" "Because," he hesitated, "it may be the last coat I'll have from Biddy's wool." He looked away from Mary and out the barn door to the sheep in the orchard. "Biddy's getting on, you know." There, he had said it. Hard as it was, he had said it. And the words had not got caught in his throat, and he felt better for having said them. "Oh," Mary exclaimed, not surprised, not troubled, just softly, as if Peter had told her the sun was going down in a little while. They turned and walked toward the house. "I'm hungry, aren't you?" Peter asked. She nodded. "Hungry as a sheep in a green meadow." "Perhaps," Peter said eagerly, "perhaps Mother will have stew." They broke into a run, bare feet nimble on the grass. Early that evening, while the light was still clear in the sky and soft over the land, Peter and Mary walked down to the valley. The brown wool had been bundled into a tight pack, and Peter carried it on his back. The air was full of sound, the deep tones of the sheep and the gentle bleat of the lambs, reunited at last. For after the shearing, they had been perplexed about their mothers, and Biddy's lamb had been one of the worst. Shorn skin and bony legs meant little of the familiar. But now with the evening had come recognition, and the sound that hung on the air, carried by the warm wind, was a sound of perfect bliss. "Biddy's lamb was such a naughty one today," Mary was saying. "3 times, Peter, she went under the fence, and I had to bring her back. And once when she was just about to try the lettuce plants coming up in your garden." "She's got spirit," Peter nodded with pleasure. "She'll make a leader just like Biddy one day." "I shouldn't think naughtiness would mean that." Exploration, courage. How could Peter explain that's what the black ewe lamb had showed, and that was what had counted for so much? Most of the flock would follow wherever a leader went, but were fearful of going anywhere without a leader. It was important that every now and then a flock should produce a sheep with wit, as well as fleece and bone. "Wait and see," Peter contented himself with saying. "She may lead us many a chase this year, but she'll lead the flock another year." They walked along in a silence that was no silence, for it was the time of day when the birds had much to say to each other and to the world. As they drew nearer the cottage, the sound of the spinning wheel came out to meet them, drawing them toward it with its soft whirring croon. Peter thought, as he heard it, that if one could catch the sound of time going by, days and seasons into years, it might be like that of the wheel. "Is it always with you, that sound?" He bent his head toward the cottage. "Of course," Mary smiled. "It's our work, our living, just as you have the bleating sound of sheep around you." "Oh," Peter said, reminded of the chorus of buzz that marked the year. "Only it isn't always the wheel," Mary went on. That belongs to the summer, when the shorn wool is being spun into yarn. In the winter, it's the click-clack of the loom, when the yarn is woven into cloth. Which do you like better?" She turned the question on him. "Do you like the little bleat a lamb makes, or the deep baa of a sheep?" He saw why she had done it, and a smile spread slowly across his face. "I like them both." "Well then, so do I like both the sounds of our work." He stood at the doorway of the cottage, and Mary's granny came to greet them. She saw the wool on Peter's shoulder, but even more than that, she saw the coat on his back. It was not the rents and the frays that caught and held her eye, but her handiwork and how it had served him for 5 years. "Another coat you're wanting," was all she said, "and you've need." Peter handed her his wool, the best fleece in the flock, Biddy's. She fingered it. "It's strong and soft, too." Then she put it to her nose. "But it's got a smell of sheep to it, so that Biddy's lamb will be following you as well as her mother." "Oh, but I want it that way," Peter said. "It's your coat," she answered briefly. "And if it does as well as the first one, it will carry you right up to manhood." That seemed a long time off to Peter. She was feeling the wool, fingering it for its fiber, running a bit between her palms so it came out a thread. "You've not brought me so much as the time before," she said. "It will take almost all I have here to make a coat for you, big as you are now, and what's left over might just go to make a little vest." Peter's eyes shone. A vest! That was like a man to have a vest. If there's no wool left over for you to take as a dress for Mary, how shall I pay you for it, Granny?" She thought for a moment, then she spoke. "Near the summer's end, there'll be work to be done here. Give me 3 days choring about, and that will be fair pay. And at that time, I'll have the coat ready for you to wear back." Peter had not looked over toward Mary, but somehow he knew what she was thinking. "I'm glad to do the work for you, but I'd like to pay you in wool too," he said firmly. Granny looked at the wool again. "Did your sheep lamb this year?" "She did," Peter answered quickly. "As fine a black lamb as you've ever seen, but no finer than her mother when she was my little Cosset." "Then, when the black lamb is sheared next spring, bring me some of the wool for Mary." "Indeed I will, Granny." Laughter flashed into Peter's eyes. He turned to Mary and saw the pleasure she was sharing with him at the way the bargain had gone. Darkness was settling over the valley, and Peter, his business done, had no longer any reason to stay. "Goodbye, Granny. I'll be down at summer's end to do your work and wear my coat back." "Shall I come to help tomorrow?" Mary was asking. "Oh, yes," Peter said quickly, "for the shearing's not half done, and there's work for all of us." Mary was glad. She liked the work with the sheep. Peter started up the road, past the houses with lights in their windows that cast faint gleams upon the way, into the open land where his lights were the stars. There was one that hung low in the sky over his home, and he had used it more than once to guide him. When the road started to climb, he could see the dim outline of their house and the glow from the lamp on the kitchen table. Even without the light, he would have found his way, for the sound of the sheep still talking to each other and to their lambs drew him on.